So there's going to be 4 of us speaking, so I'm going to start because I'm here, then we'll hear from Paul, and then Ben and Hannah can go whenever they fancy. So yeah, sorry, this is really casual. Okay, so what I'm going to say first is, to the people who don't know me, because I know there's quite a few of you that do, is, do I look sick? Do I look like I've got anything wrong with me? No, but I do, because I've got what is referred to as an invisible illness. I don't look ill, but I am ill. So the best way for me to explain to you guys how it feels to have a chronic illness is through something called the spoon theory. Has anyone ever heard of that? Yeah, there's a few of you. Shut up. So I'm going to say it pretty much how the person called Christine wrote it, because she explains it so well that I don't want to change it, because I think it'll take away from it. So Christine explained that the difference in being sick and being healthy is having to make choices or to consciously think about things which the rest of the world doesn't have to. The healthy have the luxury of a life without choices, a gift most people take for granted. Most people start the day with an unlimited amount of possibilities and energy to do whatever they desire, especially young people like yourselves. For the most part, they do not need to worry about the effects of their actions. So Christine wanted to explain how it feels to have something taken away from you, because when you get diagnosed with a chronic illness, if you've previously been healthy, you feel like you've lost the life you had because you've suddenly got lots more to take into account. So in order for her to explain this, she gave her friend a bunch of spoons, because she actually wanted to be able to take something physical away from her friend, so she understands what it's like to have something taken away from her. So she gave her friend 12 spoons, and they represented that that's all you have to work with in a day, and that you can also never forget that you've got a chronic illness. It's always there, and it's something you've always got to think of. So I'm going to read the next bit exactly as Christine describes it. So I'm going to read it as if she's written it, so from her perspective, because I literally don't want to change it. It explains it so well. So she said, I asked her to list off the tasks of her day, including the most simple. As she rattled off daily chores or just fun things to do, I explained how each one would cost her a spoon. When she jumped right into getting ready for work as her first task of the morning, I cut her off and I took away a spoon. I practically jumped down her throat. I said, no, you don't just get up, you have to crack open your eyes and then realise that you were late. You didn't sleep well the night before. You have to crawl out of bed, and then you have to make yourself something to eat before you can do anything else. Because if you don't, you can't take your medicine, and if you don't take your medicine, you might as well give up all your spoons for today and tomorrow. I quickly took away a spoon, and she realised she hadn't even gotten dressed yet. Showering cost her a spoon too, just for washing her hair and shaving her legs. Reaching high and low that early in the morning could actually cost more than 1 spoon, but I figured I would give her a break. I didn't want to scare her right away. Getting dressed was worth another spoon. I stopped her and broke down every task to show her how every little detail needed to be thought about. You cannot simply just throw clothes on when you're sick. I explained that I have to see what clothes I can physically put on. If my hands hurt that day, buttons are out of the question. If I have bruises that day, I need to wear long sleeves, and if I have a fever, I need a jumper to stay warm, and so on. If my hair is falling out, I need to spend more time to look presentable, and then you need to factor in another 5 minutes for the fact that it took you over 2 hours to do all this. I think she was starting to understand when I explained that theoretically she hadn't even got to work and she was left with 6 spoons. I then explained to her that she needed to choose the rest of her day wisely, since when your spoons are gone, they are gone. Sometimes you can borrow against tomorrow's spoons, but just think how hard tomorrow will be with less spoons. I also needed to explain that a person who is sick always lives with the looming thought that tomorrow may be the day that a cold comes, or an infection, or any number of things that could be very dangerous. So you don't want to run low on spoons, because you never know when you will truly need them. I didn't want to depress her, but I needed to be realistic, and unfortunately being prepared for the worst is part of a real day for me. We spent the rest of the day, and she slowly learnt that skipping lunch would cost her a spoon, as well as standing on a train or spending too long during work. She was forced to make choices and think about things differently. When we got to the end of her pretend day, she said she was hungry. I summarised that she had to eat dinner, but she only had 1 spoon left. If she cooked, she wouldn't have enough energy to clean the pots. If she went out for dinner, she might be too tired to drive home safely. Then I also explained something that I hadn't bothered adding into the game, is that she probably felt so nauseous that cooking wasn't really possible anyway. So she decided to make soup because it was easy. I then said, it's only 7 p.m, you have the rest of the night, but maybe, you know, you could have another spoon so you can do something fun or clean your apartment or do chores, but that you can't do it all. So that was written by Christine, someone who's got lupus, and I think it perfectly sums up how it feels to live with a chronic illness. I've got something that's called Crohn's disease. I don't know if anyone here has heard of it who doesn't know me, but that explains how it feels like when I'm in what's considered a flare, which is when your disease is active. It's often referred to as a bowel disease for those that don't know, but in reality it affects my entire digestive system from my mouth to my anus. I was diagnosed at the age of 18, a month before I came to university. I spent 9 days in hospital, and I was told the likelihood of me actually getting to university was not possible, and I was told to consider a gap year, but I didn't, and I came anyway because I never listen to what I'm told. By the time I was actually diagnosed with Crohn's, the disease had affected my entire colon and 2 parts of my small intestine. So the way Crohn's works is it thinks that your healthy bacteria in the body is actually foreign bacteria, so your immune system then attacks itself essentially. And the way to describe how the disease manifests is kind of like it's like ulcers essentially all along your digestive system. So when you're ill with Crohn's, you have debilitating stomach cramps, and my friend actually told me it was quite like labour because you get pains every 10 minutes. I've got burns on my stomach from where I've put hot water bottles because nothing helps the pain essentially. And because of what Crohn's disease is, you're not allowed to take any medication stronger than paracetamol for it because of the way that things such as ibuprofen and codeine interact with the disease. So when I'm ill, obviously I'm in pain. Of course it's bowel disease. I spend most of my time in the toilet. I can't sleep. I'm continuously exhausted. I can't eat because I can have as many as 12 mouth ulcers, heartburn, acid, because when you're ill it basically spreads the whole of your digestive system, which of course being Mental Health Week is affects your mental health quite a lot because you feel so terrible. People don't think you look ill, so you're being judged. I have a radar key, which gives me access to disabled toilets, and I've been shouted at countless times because people don't think there's anything wrong with me and that I'm just using them because I can't be bothered to queue, essentially. So I got put on a medication called azathioprine, which is an immunosuppressant. So essentially my immune system is not as strong as a normal person's anyway because of Crohn's, but it's been lowered again due to my medication. So when I got to uni, I was put into remission for 9 months, which meant I had little or no symptoms and relatively low inflammation level. So I spent the first year fine. I felt like everyone else did. I felt like I did before I got ill. It was great. And then I started to get ill again. So I got put on oral steroids called prednisolone. I can never say it properly. You think I'd know by now. But then I started a vicious cycle whereby every time my steroids were reduced before a certain point, I got ill again. On some occasions, my inflammation level, which is how they measure how active the disease in my body was as high as 85, when a normal level for a person with Crohn's is considered below 15, and in a healthy person it's considered below 10. So I was then referred to start a biologic treatment called infliximab. But this meant that I had to spend even more time on steroids, which affected my mental health even further because a side effect of steroids is causing severe anxiety and depression. And they've just got so many side effects. Basically, they're really good medication, but the other stuff they do to you is horrible. I suffered from something called moon face, which is actually a technical medical term, and basically it describes that your face looks like a moon. So if you think of a hamster when they basically stuff a load of food, that's what I look like permanently, to the point where I'd go out like to a nightclub or something and I'd actually get accused by the bouncers of nicking my ID because I didn't look like what I looked like anymore. It causes water retention, so I put over 5 stone on in under 3 months. So I've got quite bad stretch marks now as well. So of course, on top of the anxiety and depression being caused, this was just adding to it even further, as you can imagine. The best way to describe how I felt is kind of like, you know, where you blow a balloon up and you get to just before it pops. It sort of felt like that permanently. You have insomnia as well. I had this all during my uni exams, during lectures. It messed with my emotions. I'd be like calm and normal 1 minute and then like the Incredible Hulk another. I remember one time my dad didn't bring me something back from the shop, and I literally told him like I didn't want to see him again, he was the worst father ever, and then spent about 3 hours crying. And I started to have panic attacks really badly about being in public places, partly caused by the medication, partly caused, through just I was worried about being out and about and etc. Some days I just didn't want to leave the house, and honestly some days I thought that not being here was a better option than what I was going through between suffering from Crohn's and the side effects of the medication. But this does have a happy ending. Sorry, that was really depressing. I started infliximab in November of last year, and I finished steroids on August the 6th after nearly 2 years on them permanently. I'm currently in remission. Woo! I feel good, and I nearly look like I used to as well. I'm practically almost there, which is great. So now hopefully I can actually go out and use my ID and no one's going to say it's not me. With Crohn's and with any chronic long-term illness, there is no guarantees. You do not know what's going to happen. I will get ill again at some point. I will be put back on steroids, hopefully not for 2 years this time, and they'll actually get their act together and get me off them in the time they're meant to. And hospital admission is a probability again. I may need operations. If I do, I will have to have my entire colon removed because Crohn's has destroyed it essentially, and I'll be given a colonostomy bag, so I'm trying to avoid that. Nothing wrong with them, but not now, not for me at the moment. And I'd be foolish to ignore that, but yeah, I'm here now, and if anything I'd like to think that I prove that you can do anything if you put your mind to it. You've got to allow that you can be sick, and there's times that you can't, but when you're well, I think you've just got to live life to the full. So yeah, that's me bit done. So yeah. Paul's going to speak now, so come on.
Hi guys. I don't have a physical disability, but nevertheless, disability has a massive impact on my life. I'm a carer for my wife, who suffers with a chronic illness. As a carer, I'm responsible for most of her basic needs. It's a full-time job, and I have to be on hand 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like hundreds of thousands of other carers in the country, I struggle with mental illness. My depression was not caused by my role as a carer. However, because caring is such a stressful and time-consuming role, it does make dealing with depression extremely difficult. Sometimes it feels impossible. When I first started struggling with depression, I felt like I wasn't allowed to be sick. I felt that I didn't have the right to it. I was the carer after all. I wasn't the one who was living with the chronic illness. I know that some of you listening might feel the same. You might feel that there's been nothing in your life to justify mental illness. You might have a great life and feel like you've got nothing to be depressed about. Let me tell you that mental illness doesn't need a reason to affect your life. In the same way as you don't have to smoke to get lung cancer. It was a long time before I accepted that I had an issue that I needed to deal with, rather than one I could ignore. I realised, as I hope you all do, that it's okay to feel anxious sometimes. It's okay to feel depressed. It's okay to be afraid. Whatever your situation, don't be ashamed or let the problem fester like I did. Take that step, ask for help, and begin to deal with it. Facing mental illness head on doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger. No matter who you are, we all need help from time to time. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all human. None of us are above needing support. I found that it took a lot more courage to admit that I needed help than to bury my head in the sand and deciding to go it alone. I was once obsessed with the idea that I had to manage everything by myself, that I couldn't seek or accept help. I thought that needing help meant that I'd failed myself and my wife. I stubbornly stuck to this false notion until I was consumed by feelings of failure and self-loathing. Eventually, I ended up in hospital. It almost destroyed me. For some people, mental illness is a lifelong battle. Over the past 3 years, I've worked hard to overcome depression. I've equipped myself with weapons and a faith that helps me fight it. But this doesn't mean that it isn't there anymore. Even though I know I haven't failed when I need support, sometimes I still feel like a failure. Other times, I still feel desperately lonely and have to resist urges to hurt myself. It can be disheartening and frustrating when you feel like you've taken a step backwards, but it's all part of the process. It's normal. Thinking that you should be completely better will just put unwanted and unhelpful pressure on you. When I do slip back into bad ways of thinking and feel depression taking ground, I find it useful to remember what I've achieved. I make a point to find achievements in all areas of my life and write them down in a book so that I never forget them. Some of these are big achievements, others are small but no less significant. For example, this week I spoke to someone I didn't know in a lecture when all I wanted to do was sit alone and wallow in negativity. This might sound insignificant to you, but it was an important step in me taking back ground against mental illness. I wrote this down so that next time I feel like a failure or shrouded in darkness, I can look back and be encouraged by the small steps I've taken. I also make a point to find achievements in negative situations. This year is actually my 5th year as an undergraduate. I've had to resit 2 years of my degree. This is partly because of mental and physical illness, and partly because of the pressures of being a carer. I was very disappointed when I was forced to accept that I couldn't finish this year. It was a very hard pill to swallow. I was ashamed, and it's actually still difficult for me to talk about it today. But I can now see my achievement in this situation. I can see that after all the struggles and all the setbacks, I'm still here fighting and unwilling to give up on what's important to me. I'm much better equipped to deal with my mental health now than ever before. However, the temptation to hide away and give in to the darkness is still there. It's still strong and at times overwhelming, but I refuse to submit myself to it. I don't want a life that's controlled by depression. I don't want that for my wife, I don't want that for myself, and I don't want that for my future family. I know that I've been called for more than that. That's why I continue to fight. I will continue to speak out and make my voice heard. I will continue challenging misconceptions and stigma. Thank you.
Hello. I'm afraid I'm going to be probably a bit of a broken record because I too, as well, have over a fair few years have also suffered from depression. It's like, unfortunately, I did let it fester and have done for it was probably about 4 years until I actually was able to pluck up the courage and talk to somebody about it. I first, looking back in hindsight, noticed it kind of starting to take hold when I was probably about 12. I'm 22 now, so been dealing with it for a fairly long time. When I was about 17, I finally, I got to that point where all of a sudden it was very much just too much, and I didn't want to deal with anything at all anymore. I was living in France at the time. I'd moved there about a year and a half previous, and that obviously that didn't help, being thrown into a completely different culture where you didn't speak French. Well, you did GCSE French, but you weren't terribly good at it. And everything built up. It built up to the point where I probably got maybe about, I don't know, if I was lucky, 2 hours sleep every night. Coupled with that, I was actually at boarding school, so that made things quite boring at night, really, when everybody else is asleep and you don't have anything to entertain yourself with. A pretty bad thing was that in France you can buy sleeping pills over the counter, no issues there, and it seemed to be the easy way out. So I tried that, and looking back on it, quite luckily, really, I woke up the next morning, which was, thinking about it, I just thought, well, why, I suppose? And what I can, I guess, liken it to is a constant game of chess. I say wearing the tweed jacket and the shirt and whatever. But you're playing against yourself, and whereas in chess you'd think about what your opponent's going to do, you'd think maybe 3 moves ahead, whatever else, you can't know, because you're not playing against a person, you're playing against a mind that changes erratically from day to day, minute to minute even. So it's a constant kind of changing game all the time. And I think that's the best thing I've ever described it as, actually. I'm quite proud of myself. That's good. So I mean, in the end, it took a long time to deal with. But so I thought to myself, why had it taken so long? Why wasn't I able to talk to my parents about it? I think that was one of the main things. In the end, it was good enough that I got to see a psychologist, etc., and was prescribed fluoxetine for a few years, which is Prozac, is the market name for it, so you all know that, which helped a lot, and I'm off it now, which is great. But again, I was thinking a lot to myself, which isn't normally a good thing, but I kind of took a step back and took a look at myself from, I suppose, an outsider's point of view, and I was like, what was I? First of all, I'm a man, I very much am, and a white middle class male. It's what Paul's saying. Paul, sorry, yeah, it's Paul. So I'm terrible with names. I'm really bad. Was saying it felt like I had no reason to feel the way I was. By all accounts, I'd had a very, quite a privileged upbringing. I was lucky enough to have that, and to this day, with like some people that I've met, and we've got into this chat about it and the kind of thing. But why? After I tell them, lived in West London, grew up, parents both together, etc. All these kinds of things, and they just think, well, why? You don't have a reason. They say that, and even I thought that for a good few years. But then, again, I realised that, mental illness doesn't care. It doesn't care at all. It'll take you whether you're black, white, Jewish, Christian, atheist, poor, rich, whatever else. You just have to deal with it as and when it comes. Luckily, though, you don't have to deal with it alone, which I think is the main point here that I'm going to at least try and make, and I think that what everyone kind of who might do these talks tries to make, you don't have to deal with it alone, no matter if you think that somebody doesn't care or somebody doesn't want to deal with it. There'll always be someone who does want to help you, which is why I do what I do with mental wealth here. I found it's a good way for me to kind of temporarily forget about my issues and be able to help somebody else, and that feels good. So that's what I do. Going back to being a man, there's a large social stigma against big butch manly men. Nothing's wrong with them. They support the weight of everything on their shoulders, and it's all fine. It's not really. It's not that great. But luckily, I think it's very slowly changing. there was a campaign. I can't remember whether it was actually a joke campaign or a real one last year, but there were big silhouettes of men, and they had giant like sacks of balls underneath spread legs, and the slogan was, "I had the balls to ask for help," which, you know, for a kind of a quite far-reaching public campaign seemed to me to be quite, you know, yes, good. And I've got some notes here, sorry. Perhaps by fate or karma, I don't know. Today I was surfing the web, as you do when you're a media student, and I came across this site called Bro Tips. So, you know, you hear the word bro and you automatically think, you know, lad, whatever that is. And it came onto this site just immediately, and it was at Bro Tip number 1443. So how this site has carried on, I've got no idea. But it said, respect any bro that asks for help. At least they admitted they have a problem. Which I think for somebody who might have come from that whole lad culture, to have actually written that on the internet, might not necessarily know who it was that wrote it, but for it to be out there just by itself with no comments after it, nothing like that, I think is just, it's fucking excellent, really. It's just brilliant. So I mean, for me, I still tangent over, I still struggle with it, I'm not going to lie. It's not something that goes away. I don't think it can really be cured as such, like a cold or anything like that. Sure, you can take meds to help with it, but you do live with that realization that it will come back at some point. It will, whether it's mild, whether it's full-blown, whatever. But you can talk about it. I've found that I can talk about it, and I feel much better for it. Sure, that might not work for other people, but I think for a lot of people that I've talked to who have decided that they don't want to talk about it, it's actually more that they haven't tried talking about it, and that they haven't, I suppose, been able to say to themselves that I need to go and talk about it, because at the end of the day it's an incredibly hard thing to do, and it takes a lot of guts to admit to yourself first and foremost that you have an issue that needs dealing with, and then to admit to those that you love and care for as well, I think is, if not harder than than thinking to yourself. But the other thing is that if you don't talk, you basically eliminate any chance of getting better. So, yeah. Thank you.
One thing I will say before I start, anything that I'm passionate about, I have a tendency to go on. So I apologise in advance. Firstly, I'm Hannah, and I'm going to talk to you today about hip dysplasia, which is a physical illness. Probably we'll do something to start with. Put your hand up if you've ever heard of hip dysplasia. Okay. Do you know someone with it? Or is that just heard of it? Most people, I know some people might get annoyed with me saying this, but most people have heard of hip dysplasia because it's very common in dogs, especially golden retrievers. So, but obviously I'm not a dog. That's the main comment you normally get when you you tell anyone you've got hip dysplasia. Hip dysplasia is also known by a multiple of names: congenital dysplasia of the hip, developmental dysplasia of the hip, or just plain dislocated hips. So there's so many names for one condition. It's all exactly the same. It just depends on when you've been diagnosed, whether it's been at birth, later on in life. Some people are diagnosed, in my case I was diagnosed at 18 months. Some people aren't diagnosed till they're 40, 50. Okay, when you are born you normally have a test which they do as the clicky hip test, where they roll the hips and then they will see if it rolls smoothly or whether it jerks out of position. In my case, this was carried out, and the doctor said, yes, you've got hip dysplasia, but I've just done 5 babies in a row, all of which have it, so give me an hour, I'll come back and double check. The hour quickly passed. He came back and gave me the all clear and told me I didn't have it, or told my parents. So this was a big mistake, but as always, your mum, having just had a newborn baby, carried me out like I was the normal bundle of joy she had expected. One thing most people find quite strange that was never picked up, I never crawled. I'm sure you're wondering, how did I get around? This was, for 2 years I never crawled, didn't try to attempt to walk or anything. I shuffled around on my bottom the whole way around the house and ended up with very sore bottom at the end of it. I did eventually manage to pull myself up and pull myself around the house and started walking. I was around 2 at the time when I was taken to the doctors with a different illness, and my mum had just recently noticed that I started walking like a ballerina. The doctor also noticed this and immediately placed me on the bed and asked my mum to take me straight to hospital for some immediate x-rays. My mum was scared to death. She knew something was wrong straight away, but the doctor didn't want to put thoughts into her head. I had my x-rays taken and I was told I did in fact have hip dysplasia, and it was misdiagnosed on that second test. If only we went with gut instincts. Shortly I was taken into hospital and had 2 major operations, which are called osteotomies for anyone who's interested in the science behind it. Basically it's the breakage of the hip joint, then reform it to form the ball and socket, and then they inserted metal plate and screws into my hip. I was lucky enough for this to be only on my left side. Some of my friends do have it on both hips. I was then placed in a spiker plaster, which is a frog's legs plaster, and unlike my best friend, mine wasn't green, thankfully, so I didn't look like a frog. Once I had fully recovered from these 2 major operations, I was living a normal child's life, running around the playground, crawling around, rolling around, and of course falling over like any child does. This was with no worry or care in the world. There was no fear that I would damage the joint. One of my greatest achievements in my life thus far has to be the completion of my Bronze Duke of Edinburgh Award. I managed to do this pain-free. I was petrified to do it because I always thought, I'm not the best at sports, but I will do it. And a few of my friends went, but you can't do mega sports like hockey, because I was scared that anything would happen to my hip. I was a little slower as my hip was weaker, so my leg was a little bit slower at walking it, but I did it. And I was only about 10 minutes behind the group in front of us. I was walking normally around the house one evening when my whole world came crashing down around me. I felt a rapid shoot of acute pain in my left hip. This was horrid, and this really caught me off guard as I'd never experienced any pain. I couldn't walk at all. I put an ice pack on it and took some painkillers, hoping it would settle down. Tried to go to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Everything was just a real struggle. I couldn't get comfortable, nothing. It was absolutely horrendous, and going back to that night and thinking of that night really does get me upset. The next morning I woke up and thought, I'm shattered, but I'm going to go to school. Couldn't get dressed, so I asked my mum to come and help me because I was determined I wasn't going to let this beat me. However, my legs had gone swollen over the evening. We then started to worry that this could be something major, so went straight to a casualty to get some help. At first, they all panicked in Casualty Plus as they panicked that it was a blood clot. Thankfully, it was not, and the bloods came back clear. But I was so uneasy when I was told an orthopaedic surgeon was on his way to speak to me. I knew at this moment that it was going to be a long recovery. It wasn't just going to fix itself there and then. I met this orthopaedic surgeon who was called Adam. Adam was absolutely fantastic, and I owe him loads. But I instantly took a dislike to Adam when the results of my x-rays came in. Not because he was a nasty person or he was not good at delivering stuff, but he was delivering me the news that I had hoped that I would never get till I was 80 or at the earliest 50 or 60 years old. I was 17 and I was told I needed a hip replacement. 4 years on from this appointment, I can now understand how hard it must have been for my surgeon Adam to turn round to me and deliver such news. when in fact I now know the youngest person who he'd ever delivered this news to prior to me was 40. Being 17 was a completely different situation. My reaction was unexpected for him. He didn't think someone would just burst out in tears, turn around and say, "I hate you," turn and face the wall and sit in the corner, saying nothing. And every time my mum tried to speak, I told her to be quiet. He decided that I needed time to digest this information and gather my thoughts, and actually time to prepare myself mentally for what was going to happen. He decided he was going to give me a phone call at home where I could get comfortable and decide and get anyone around me who I needed around me for support in a few hours to discuss what options we were going to have. I remember getting straight back into the car and crying the whole way home. I couldn't say a word to my mum. I couldn't say a word to anything. I remember her ringing my grandma to tell her and just telling them to hang up and leave it. I wanted to be left in complete silence. I just wished that someone would come and give me a massive hug and tell me everything was going to be okay. But I knew that was never going to solve anything, and that wasn't even going to happen. And for this chance, I was on a massive journey. I'm not going to bore you with every single detail of that 2-year journey. From the news that I received that I needed a hip replacement in September 2009, however, Adam did later phone me and told me that they would try everything to try and put it off. Sadly, the NHS refused to do hip replacements on anyone under the age of 21. This is due to the fact that your hip joint stops growing at 21, and prior to this there are major risks. Although my mum had BUPA cover with work, and I did go in privately, my surgeon was still worried, because obviously they don't do it on the NHS for a reason. Research wasn't good. Everywhere I went for help, I got leaflets, "As you're getting older." This didn't help for me at 17. I tried everything. I had so many that I tried last night sitting down and counting them and couldn't count them. Steroid injections under both local and general anaesthetics. The amount of anaesthetic that was in my body was pretty shocking. The amount of x-rays that I've had is scary to think of, as well as an arthroscopy, which is to clean out the joint and try and just preserve the joint for as long as they can. They bought me originally months, then weeks, then days, then hours, then nothing. When it got to the point of hours and nothing, I decided I'm not putting myself through this anaesthetic anymore. So I was placed in a wheelchair. It was around Christmas time and Adam phoned me and said, "We're going to have to take the plunge and do this hip replacement." I was still 17, so I thought, what's changed? He'd spoken to the top surgeons around the country. I went to London, I went to Sheffield, and I spoke to everyone possible. I spoke to surgeons in America, everywhere. They all agreed it was the only option. I went into Adam's office and was told the risks. The risks of this, which I must admit are still in the back of my mind every day. The fact that they said they can't be certain, but you'll probably never be able to have children. This, obviously at 17, was the least of my worries. But as you get older and people start talking about having a family, it does become more prominent in your mind. And you do think, what will happen? I was also at school on a daily basis called a cripple, a word which I hate and I'm sure most people here would never use. Sadly, this was just their way of dealing with it. They didn't want to talk to me, nothing. I was in a wheelchair or on crutches if the school wasn't accessible in some areas. And to be completely honest, the support at school by my fellow peers was unbelievably bad. If it wasn't up to my family support at home, I don't think I would have got through it. My mum and my grandma and my close friends, extended family were amazing, and I owe them absolutely everything. I know it must have aged them about 20 years going through it with me, and I will never forget my mum saying to me, "If I could take this away from you, I would." I'm sure they lost more sleep over it than I did. I finished my AS level examinations on the Friday and went straight into hospital for my hip replacement. I actually remember my French teacher turning around to me and saying, "Are you okay?" because I'd gone as white as a sheet. She wasn't too sure whether this was because I'd finished my exams and the relief, or the fact that I knew what was next. I will say that has to be the best day of my life. Not because I was looking forward to the long summer ahead, or the fact that exams were over, but it was the start of my new life. I am now 2 years post my hip replacement. I am able to walk pain-free. Yes, when it gets colder I do moan about pain. And I am loving life and the happiest that I have ever been. But it wasn't without its challenges and ups and downs. Thankfully, I met so many great people along the way. I got in touch with a charity called Steps, and they were absolutely amazing. But even they realised that there was a gap because they didn't have anything for teenagers. Instead of turning me away, they asked me to come into their office and to organise this section for them. Later, I have set up my own website, which we now have 100 members on, and I've spoken to 100 teenagers who are all awaiting for surgery or hip replacements, and all of which who are truly inspired by the work that we do. There is a complete lack of support and public knowledge. A lot of you, some of you might know me from last week, wandering around like a mad woman in a onesie, in a Hello Kitty onesie, looking like an idiot, quite frankly, trying to raise awareness of hip dysplasia, and we raised £240, and it was just meeting people and spreading the word that gave me such joy. I've also linked with other organisations in America, including One Hip World and other organisations, done lots of press interviews, and my most scary thing has to be doing the talk now, because I hate public speaking, and I'm shaking like anything. The tiredness that I suffered due to the medication that I was on. For 2 years, I was on medication, I was on crutches or in a wheelchair. It really did have an effect. The fear now of the pain recurring, of falling over, doing anything. My way of sadly dealing with it when I came to university was to tell no one. I told absolutely no one, due to the fact that I was scared that I was going to get the same comments as I did at school. Thankfully, I now know everyone's a lot maturer now, and everyone knows how to deal with these things. This all became apparent, sadly, when I was rushed into hospital Christmas last year. I was in my flat in St Kenneth and literally just collapsed in pain. But because no one knew what was wrong with my hip, no one knew what to do. So I had to quickly tell them and get to hospital. Being so far away from my family support was the greatest difficulty and challenge that I had to overcome. I had no one there for me. I remember ringing around my friends, posting on my website and everything to call them for help, but nothing would work. I just wanted them to be there with me now. The support from the SWD and the rest of the uni was overwhelming. The support when I started telling my flatmates, course mates and friends was also overwhelming. It's one thing that made me feel less lonely. Through this whole journey I felt completely alone and isolated. And the one thing that I ask that everyone takes away is to talk and ask for help. Asking for help is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. Because you all, as everyone's already said, it feels like a weakness. It definitely is not. But I will say the support that I have received since coming to uni has been amazing. My friends and family continue to support me. And thank you for all being here tonight.
Does anyone have any questions for any of us?
I do actually. Hannah, Rachel.
Yeah.
If I could be Rachel. You both brought up the issue of I suppose, mental distress in relation to physical illness. And I was wondering, you both said you got quite a lot of help medically from the NHS. Mm-hmm. Did they offer any kind of psychological support to either of you at all?
No. It's not. This wasn't taken into consideration. I think, in my experience, the NHS, their main concern is that you are physically really unwell and to the level where it can be dangerous, and their concern is making sure that you're not going to die, essentially. And they don't take into consideration the impact it will have on your mental health, essentially.
Yeah, they don't think about it.
No.
Like in my case, it was once you fixed, like your hip's fixed, you've had your hip replacement, you're pain free. That's all that matters.
Mm.
I must say, the months after my hip replacement were probably the hardest because I bottled everything up. prior to my hip replacement, so I bottled it all up and sort of thought, oh, I can deal with it. And then I suddenly realised what I'd been through, and then it sort of panicked me a little bit.
Just if you could speculate on this, obviously this is not something you can make a decision on, but do you think that it was just ignorance on their part, that they didn't offer any psychological help with adjustment, or do you think it was purely a budget issue? That for chronic conditions they can't afford to spend that much?
I think it's a combination of both. I think they don't take into consideration the impact that the adjustments you're going to have to make. You're suddenly going from like living life quite normally to suddenly, like in my experience, after I was 18 being diagnosed, that I'd had 18 years of being completely normal, and then suddenly I've got told I've got this lifelong condition. They don't know what it's going to do to me. They don't know how, how I'm going to cope with it. And obviously, from placement, I know the waiting list to see a psychologist in the NHS is very, very long. So I think they just don't consider sending you along as well, because it's just adding numbers, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I would say, and I think really they don't think it will have unless you raise the thought. And normally the whole impacts of it come a bit after you've been discharged, and when you are in the hospital, you're not thinking about the impact on you, and you're sort of are thinking, I want to be cured. Well, I want to hear what the next step is, kind of thing.
Yeah.
More than that, and it is. Even I'm on the campaign at the moment on my website to get even a referral to a charity who can put you in touch with others, so you can talk to someone, so you're not alone, and hopefully those feelings and thoughts don't manifest.
Do you think that the NHS should consider more responsibility on their part? Because I know they have to fix you in terms of the physical side, but they don't think they have a responsibility as well as your mental health. What do you know?
Yeah, I think at the very least they should be signposting. So they say, it could be quite a shock to be told you've got this or to have operations. So, if you think you're struggling, we suggest you go here or something along those lines. Would be quite helpful. Because I was quite lucky in the term that my father's got ulcerative colitis, which is it's a lesser form of Crohn's disease essentially, because it only affects your colon. So I was more aware of what to expect and the impact it has, whereas I think especially if you don't know what's coming, I struggled enough being diagnosed with knowing about the illness, so I think being told about it when you have no idea at all is quite a lot to take in.
Yeah, I'd say being signposted at least. Obviously it's up to you as the individual, as you the patient, whether you follow it up. Most people might say, might take a dim view on them posting you somewhere. But it's even just looking back on it, the worst thing was the fact that I was told I needed a hip replacement and was left to go on the internet and research, and that was one of the worst things I could do, because everything is stuff like that. It is more you're signposted to someone who you can talk to and stuff like that. Yeah. And that there's continuing support, because to be honest with you, if I could pick up the phone to my surgeon or someone else knowing what they're talking about to have said when I was really panicky, this is what I'm scared about.
Yeah, I was in the same situation. I got diagnosed with Crohn's. They told me when I was still loopy on anaesthetic, so I didn't really take much in. I got sent home. I wasn't due to come back for another month or so. They sent me home with meds. I collapsed at home and was admitted to hospital. So, yeah, they sort of just tell you and they go, come back in a bit and we'll go through it more. But obviously, once you know what you've got, you're researching it and you want to know more there and then. You again.
Me again, I'm afraid. I've got a question.
I can say this because I know him. I'm not being rude.
Did you seek out any kind of formal support network when you decided that you were okay to talk about it?
I was quite lucky in the fact that I had my cousin who was going through the same kind of thing as well. So even though he lives in Perth in Western Australia, so slight issue with communication, but to kind of know, I suppose in a way, what to expect, and like you should have said, to have some kind of idea of what you might go through, helps a lot, really. Support network wise, I would say apart from that, obviously my parents were there for me, and I had a good friend network as well, which actually I think is something purely to do with being in France at the time. The French are very, for all their idiosyncrasies and being French, are very open about any kind of illness at all. So you can practically talk. You probably could easily just go to someone completely random on the street and say, "Hey, I've got this. Do you want to talk about it?" And they'd probably be fairly interested in it. And I'd had friends there whose family members are the same thing. So I wouldn't say I went out and sought a network, but it all just kind of fit together and fell into place. And I suppose, like I said, I saw a psychologist for probably a couple of years whilst I was out there as well, which I think again sums up the French attitude towards it. And like every village, basically, I mean, I live in a village, back there I live in a village of about 200 people. The nearest town is probably 1,000, but it's only 3 kilometres away, and even that town has, like, I think 2 residential psychologists living in the place. And the further you go up, population-wise, the more you have. It's seen as just something that needs to be dealt with, that kind of thing. So that, in a way, was very helpful as well.
That was good. Going on from that, both the girls mentioned that they sought out information themselves using the internet about what they were facing. Did you do that as well?
Not at the time. At the time I was just like, right, no, you should just leave that where I'll go away. They didn't. I suppose I never really went and searched for it, because I saw the psychologist and she was very matter of fact about it. She said this could happen, this is basically what's happening in the brain. Studies with this, but obviously it's different, it depends on every person. She made that very clear. So any information that I ever needed, or I just have a question, I could email her as well, which was nice.
That's really good.
So I had the wealth of information there if I wanted it. I think I didn't really want it at the time, but in hindsight, I suppose I don't think going and seeking it out myself prior to doing that would have helped, because I would have had all those preconceptions that you get from people who go out and research it themselves. Even if they don't have it, you go to them and you say, "Oh yeah, I've got this," and they're like, "Oh, so you must," and etc., etc., etc. So I think for me personally, not going and finding it before I saw the professional, I think helped.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I was going to say that thanks for having the courage to share your stories, because like it does matter. And I don't know, my story's a bit different, but like whilst I was at uni, I'm not a student anymore, graduated 2 years ago, but coming on to support Paul, I was a young adult carer, and just felt like there's nothing out there, and you think you're alone, don't you? Like it's only you going through it. And it wasn't only till like I think it was the weekend I went to a carers trust ball, and I met a guy who was looking after his parent with bipolar disorder, and it was the first time in 15 years that somebody completely got it to a T. Do you know, like, oh, the frustration. But no, thank you so much for sharing stories. It it means a lot to me as a former student here, and like it's good to see that you're sharing it and not just bottling it up. And because I just felt a bit like not an alien in Cardiff, but a bit like, oh my god, I'm the only one here who is got a parent with mental health problems, and the university just doesn't get it, totally doesn't get it. But I think they're getting better, I hope, and you're doing a lot of work around that. I'm going to shut up, but like, thank you so much for letting me come along and listen.
Thank you for coming.
It's good.
Anyone else? Cool, thank you very much for coming. I hope it's been helpful. Yeah.